Welcome to Shaping the NYC Skyline, the podcast that explores the stories behind the buildings that shape our city. I'm your host, David Shamshovich, and I'm here with my co-host,
Brenda Slakowski. Hey, guys.
Hello, Camilla and Brenda, and hello to our Skyliners joining us on the Skyline Express. Next stop, an awesome podcast. So we had Jamie Smarr, the president and CEO of the Housing Partnership, on, and he was amazing. He's experienced, he knows his stuff, and although he's from Charlotte, North Carolina, he really is, he's a New Yorker, right?
He's not a New Yorker.
He loves his place.
You can see it. He's such a New Yorker.
And he wants to see this place grow, flourish economically from a housing perspective. And you can tell that the things that he says are genuine. His background, his education, and his upbringing, and all the experiences he's had really all make him a great fit to be leading up Housing Partnership.
Yeah. He's coming from a place of practically enhancing your community, because if you have housing, you have schools. If you have schools, you have economic activity, you have more stores, you have more retail, and it really all comes full circle. And you see it in his approach, his role as president at the Housing Partnership.
Not only that, but he has the approach that combines both private and public relationships. And that's key for everything.
Yeah. And relationships is one of the things, not only just the private public relationships, which you mentioned, Camilla, but also the relationships that took him from one position to another. And that's not dissimilar from basically every single guest we've had. You need those relationships. Nothing is done in a vacuum, and nothing is done that doesn't affect other things. He was previously the director of the Tax and Zoning Incentives Department at HPD, which is
our bread and butter.
Exactly. Our bread and butter. And that gave him the groundwork for his tax incentives knowledge. And he's still doing tax incentives. That's the impact that it's had. And as he's gone from the job from HPD to the New York City Educational Construction Fund to NHP Foundation and now Housing Partnership, that has persisted in his career. We think you're going to love this guest. We certainly did. And here it is, Jamie Smarr from the Housing Partnership.
Hey guys, how are you today?
I'm great. How are you guys doing?
Oh, we're always good.
We're always good. Camilla, you don't sound so enthused.
Well, it's been a lot of projects.
Late afternoon. It's fair.
Yeah. Camilla's had some interesting stuff that I won't get into. There's a lot of MIH and inclusionary housing projects that are trying to close.
Congratulations.
Yeah. They're trying, but these are difficult times, as you know.
Digging away.
I do.
So the 421A is making it very difficult. People are rushing. It's difficult to get loans, and we're definitely experiencing some of that pressure from clients, but which is why Camilla's having not the most easiest of weeks. But yeah,
courtesy of our esteemed legislature.
I've read some of your thoughts on the topic, and that's our guest. He was raised in Charlotte, North Carolina. His career has been marked with significant contributions to creation of affordable housing, public schools, residential, office, retail space. I mean, you name it. And most recently, he was named as the president and CEO of Housing Partnership Development Corporation, who we've worked with a lot in the past. We're so excited to have Jamie Smarr here.
Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming in. We're very excited to have you.
Yes. I'm glad that you did some research on my hometown because, Charlotte is an interesting place. It transformed itself from a mill culture, and now it's a fully national banking and financial center, in the space of less than 50 years, which is approximately my life. The part of Charlotte's history that I grew up in was very much a sort of factory mill town, pre-financial center type culture, where business was always closely aligned with government. So I was the last of 3 children, and the school system there was very interesting. It shaped itself around the mills and the factory culture. So the schools very much decided which kids would go work in the mills and which kids would go on to college. So I was one of the kids that actually, it was decided I would go on to college, and my education was shaped around that very much so. So after finishing and sort of being in the track, if you will, a lot of literature out there about tracking in educational systems where administrators decide which kids go to college and which ones will go to work in the mills. And I was tracked into college, had the opportunity to go to Duke University on scholarship after I finished grade school. And as they say, the rest takes care of itself. When I finished at Duke, I had the opportunity to come to New York City and work in the Giuliani administration under what was called the Urban Fellows Program at that time. So it was a tremendous opportunity for a little bald-headed black boy from North Carolina. And like they say, the rest of the history has written itself.
It's a combination of luck and having the intelligence and the ability to accomplish it, because if you had been your brother, you had been chosen for the mill, you wouldn't be sitting here before me.
That is a true statement. But one of the things that has never left left me, I would say, in my lifetime is this fundamental understanding of the relationship between business and government. It shaped my life, and it continues to shape our lives today.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of the problems that we talk about, like why can't we have lower crime? Why can't we have better neighborhoods? Why can't we have better schools? It's all shaped by the extent of our economic activity. It just very much is. If we want lower crime, if we want more educational opportunities, we have to stimulate our business base, because the business base is the fundamental job creator. When we create jobs and we have lower unemployment, we have less crime, we have more opportunities for wealth creation, we have more opportunities to go to school. All those things that make New York better in the long term. And I don't think anyone could look at New York City in the past 3 to 4 decades and not see that story told. By expanding our economic base, we have lowered our crime. We have greatly expanded opportunities to create wealth. We've created better school, and our neighborhoods are all better for that in the long term. So that story will never leave.
And that story, with housing.
Absolutely.
Right? That's the core of creating business, wealth, jobs. Without housing, you don't have any of that, really.
Yes, you probably figured out I'm very much an economic development essentialist. So housing fits right in there in that story. So I'm always on the side of we need to use our governmental tools to expand business activity. So just like we were talking about, we need to use whatever housing incentives we have to stimulate housing, because that housing activity is going to stimulate middle-class jobs. Those jobs will be construction jobs. They'll be non-construction jobs. Housing activity and housing creation fits right into that economic development essentialist argument. And it's one of the reasons that I was happy to end up at the Housing Partnership for New York City, because it's worked sort of hand in hand for the past 4 decades, along with the private real estate developers, to build and create housing in the 5 boroughs. So that opportunity, that activity must continue if we want to really be focused on continuing to move New York City forward.
Yeah, we couldn't agree more. And it's interesting. We spoke to you a little bit about this, but you come from North Carolina. Now you're in New York City, and you are a true New Yorker through and through.
Absolutely. After 24 years, absolutely.
So how does that transition happen? How do you fall in love with the city and what it's done and begin that good fight for housing, which you've done basically your entire career?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I originally had a 5-year plan for New York City. I was going to be here for 5 years. So I worked 2 years, and I went away to graduate school at Harvard. And I found out I didn't like Boston as much as New York. So
most New Yorkers don't.
A person that I had met when I worked here for those 2 years invited me back, Richard Roberts, who was then the housing commissioner at NHP. And he knew that I was finishing up graduate school at Harvard and gave me an opportunity to sort of come back and continue my career. So I tried New York, had tried Boston, had the opportunity to stay in Boston after graduate school, but I very much chose New York to come back here. And, ever since then, it's just been a series of challenging things to work on. New York is always like a series of different challenges. I came back, worked a lot of housing and zoning incentives at HPD, the original inclusionary housing program, which was not mandatory, but voluntary. So I did that for 3 years more. I then transitioned from housing into school construction, which I worked for over a decade, but very much again in that sort of economic development role.
Yeah.
Well, when you're creating new housing, you need more schooling.
Absolutely.
You had said New York should consider providing affordable housing projects with zoning exemptions, like the law that allows the city school construction authority to exempt its projects from some reviews. And, there's the City of Yes proposals to try to get rid of some of that red tape. And you were speaking to, how do we get housing and affordable housing and to the public as quickly as possible? This is one of the methods. And I assume that you got that idea or that understanding from your time at ECF.
Yes. Well, and also that idea comes from our, again, esteemed New York legislature. The legislature had decided long ago that school construction was such a mandate that they would not burden it with public approval process. So when the Department of Education decides it needs to build a school, it gets to build a school. It goes out and does the normal contracting processes, but it does not do ULURP because, again, we need our schools. We don't want NIMBYs or bananas or whatever they're called these days, sort of saying, well, you can't have a primary school here. You can't have a middle school here. We said, no, this is a fundamental public need, and we're going to put it right here.
And avoiding that ULURP process saves you years on timeline.
It would be great if we could do that for affordable housing.
Wouldn't it? Absolutely. Well, again, I think affordable housing is as much of a public mandate as a school seat. So why is the legislature not taking action here and moving this forward to sort of say, no, we need this? Housing is the key to every healthy neighborhood. Anywhere you look, housing is going to be the key. But again, looking sort of in that role of challenges, the school system itself is a pretty stealth developer of housing. They don't make a lot of publicity over it, but the school system owns over 1,500 pieces of property in the 5 boroughs. You think about that. They're huge. They're a huge sort of holder of real estate, and they will strategically develop some of those sites. I did one that's not too far from here on 57th and 2nd Avenue. It was a 4.5 acre site owned by the Department of Education with over 1 million square feet of air rights sitting on it. And for decades, it had a couple schools on it, which was great. We need our schools. But at 3 p.m., the site sort of went dead when the school closed. So you had more than a half a city block just sitting there, sort of moribund after 3 p.m. every day. But if you go by there today, we've got a retail box we got 2 brand new schools out of it. Because again, we put that mandate on the developer. We said, New York has one of the most talented real estate cores in the entire globe. We want you to build us back 2 schools, and you can have the balance of the air rights. And that's exactly what they did. So I think that project was completed approximately a decade ago. It has a retail box on the bottom, the Whole Foods and some other retail uses. It has our 2 brand new schools, and then it has an apartment tower above it. So we've now maximized that complete envelope. And the school system, I think, is enjoying something like a $4 billion capital lease over 99 years.
That's amazing.
Great creative real estate solutions. That's what New York is known for. New York needs to do more of that. It's the perfect example of marrying the public and the private sector. I worked for the school system for a decade, and I know they would not have been able to sort of get it together to develop that site themselves. But look what happened from just marrying a bit of private innovation with a public resource, and we've now got this wonderful project sitting.
How does that come about? Is it initiated, maybe that specific project or in general, if you want to do a deal with the Department of Education? Did they approach you? Did they request a proposal from the public? How did that come about? Or did the developer just say, we want to build up this area, let's approach them. They have air rights, we want to buy them, build up the area?
Well, this was very much a mandate of Mayor Bloomberg. I worked for Mayor Bloomberg for 12 years and, extremely smart man who knew that we could be getting more out of our public resource. So it was very much Mayor Bloomberg's mandate that we go out and look at more of these opportunities creatively. And we did during that time that I worked for Mayor Bloomberg, as well as Joel Klein, the school's chancellor. And so we did several projects like that. And I hear that they're continuing. And also, I'm very encouraged by recently reading some news that the Adams administration is looking to make more use of the public assets like that. But there are plenty. I don't think that New York City lacks for development sites.
Yeah.
You think about the school system owning 1,500 pieces of property, how many the library system owns, our police precincts, all these things.
Or the city, the city itself.
Yeah. So there are definitely these opportunities out there. It just takes a bit of focus and sustained focus to get people to say, hey, we could do more of these things.
How did you get from HP to doing the educational construction fund? What was that transition like, and why did you make that jump? So
my career has always been very guided by mentors. I mentioned Richard Roberts. I had another very esteemed mentor, David Klasfeld. He is actually the first person that I worked for when I'm from North Carolina to New York City in the mid-90s. And he had gone on at that time to work. He had been in the mayor's office under the Giuliani administration and had gone on to become the deputy chancellor of the school system. So I guess that's kind of how I made that transition. My career has always been greatly guided by mentors, which I'm very thankful for.
Yeah, the relationships mean everything. Relationships with clients, peers, colleagues, people in the same industry. Yes. All those relationships are important. And housing is about community. So the relationships are core to those things. When you left ECF, you went to, is it NHP?
That's right, the NHP Foundation. I worked through the end of the Bloomberg administration. So that brought me up to 2012. And that was actually the first time in my career I'd actually ever been contacted by a headhunter who let me know that there was a not-for-profit real estate developer who was looking for a role where people would be able to work with churches and other houses of faith to build affordable housing. And that just sounded like right up my alley. I was actually, I didn't mention this, but I was a religion major at Duke. I'll never forget people saying, why would you do that? You'll never get a job, which of course I laugh at today, right?
Right.
But it was actually something that fit so perfectly with my academic interest.
Yeah, talk about property owners, right? I mean,
right.
The Catholic Church
Correct.
owns a ton of property.
Yep.
The last zoning survey that I saw was that religious institutions control about 25% of the parcels in New York City.
Wow.
Yeah. So again, in that role, which I worked at the NHP Foundation for a decade approximately, I work with houses of faith here in the city, in Connecticut, but also in Florida and North Carolina and Texas, who are looking to sort of make better use of their real estate assets by partnering with the developer. So again, that story just continues throughout my life of just trying to find a way to expand economic opportunities through partnerships.
Did you see a significant difference in working with your New York-based entities rather than your Florida or out-of-state entities?
I guess not a great difference. The one thing I would point out is that New York obviously has a lot more programs and subsidy to try to make these opportunities happen. Whereas if you work in other jurisdictions, the knowledge of what's going on in other jurisdictions is priceless. It's maybe easier to get the projects done from a regulatory standpoint. I mean, Texas is great for building. They just are. They've got their stuff together, but they don't have as much subsidy as New York. So if you ever found a jurisdiction where you had the low regulatory environment and the subsidy, it would just be it's kind of bananas.
And we've heard the same thing, by the way, in Texas, and lots of the people that came on the show have talked about how they're either developing or looking to develop in Texas.
They're very eager to work to make projects happen. But I think, I would say the same thing with Florida. And that really supports the fact that those states are going through population expansions. There are people moving there, and that's driving the rental demand. So they need to build. But that sort of role, that tenure role at the NHP Foundation really shaped, again, my understanding of what you can get done through partnership. And I can't stress that enough. And then, of course, I come back to work in an organization that's called New York City Housing Partnership. So it worked out really well.
And what was the things that you enjoyed most working at the not-for-profit? I assume that because you had a religion degree, you had some level of, religious background in your own personal life.
Huh?
And the housing, your career, so like your career and the things that you're passionate about personally are coming together. What kinds of things did you really enjoy doing in that role that you accomplished?
Well, there is nothing like working with groups that have a vision already. They know what they want to do. They just don't know how to sort of fit the other pieces. So I'll give you a very good example. One of my first projects at NHP Foundation was a Pentecostal church in West Chicago called People's Church of the Harbor. So they had been in their particular neighborhood, West Garfield Park, for more than 70 years. They knew that neighborhood cold. They knew what it needed, regularly saw people coming in and out of their church, and they knew that while there were rental units in that neighborhood, there were none for large families. A lot of one bedrooms, but if you needed a 3 or 4 bedroom unit, you were going to be out of luck in West Garfield Park. And that was their vision when we showed up. We want to use our land, or a portion of our land, to build a rental project that serves predominantly larger families. And through a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, that's actually what we got built in that sort of piece of land. That was a 9% low-income tax credit housing project. But if you look at the development, a preponderance of the units are 3 and 4 bedrooms. And really, that's really the most exciting thing about working with houses of faith and religious institutions. They always have a mission. They always have a vision. And you're just trying to marry that with the bankers and helping them to understand it, and the tax credit investors, and just making that marriage happen. It's super exciting work.
Yeah, because I can imagine the economics of it could be difficult. The regulatory work could be difficult. It's not something, especially with tax credits and subsidies, it's got to be very confusing.
Absolutely. But the church would not back down. They said, there are already enough one-bedroom apartments in this neighborhood. There are already enough studios. We need to build some what they call genuine family house for renters.
It's a really interesting perspective to see, because on this podcast, we keep talking to different developers and how they go out to the community and try and figure out what the community needs in order to build that. But here you're starting from kind of a leg up where you're going to somebody who's already involved in the community saying, and at these houses of faith, and saying, what do you need? Let us build what you need.
Well, and I always remind myself of that project, when I look at something like the HPD term sheet. You imagine walking in the HPD and saying, we want to build a project that's mostly 3 or 4 bedroom. Term sheet does it? No, we're not. But again, that was a church's vision. The pastor would not back down. He didn't want to hear, well, this is what the term. She said, no, I've been in this neighborhood for almost 75 years. He had been the pastor of the church for almost 50 years.
Oh, wow.
And he said, this is what we're going to get. And we're not taking no for an answer. Just, really. So when you work with, houses of faith, religious institutions, it's really great to begin with that vision. It just makes like the development process so much interesting. You're going to end up spending 2 to 4 years of your life on this. It just like makes it so much more interesting.
I just want to turn back to your role as the director of tax and zoning incentives at HPD, because to me, that's near and dear to my heart, at least to our heart, because we work directly with housing incentives, inclusionary housing and 421A. And I was curious what HPD was like at that time. What kind of projects or problems were you seeing? What kind of projects were you particularly proud of? Anything that stands out in your mind as successes at that time, or how you did your work at that time?
Well, it was certainly a different political philosophy. I mean, I think during that time, it was very much, we have these incentives from the legislature, and we're going to work with the private sector to make sure that they result in affordable housing production and whatever other legislative goal existed at that time. And I think it was like very much a environment where we sort of recognized that government and the private sector needed to work together to greatly expand affordable housing supply. I don't sense that so much today. It's more of an adversarial relationship. There's been a lot of debate about incentive packages. Do developers need incentives? I saw an article in the New York Times recently that actually had that title. Do developers need incentives to build? But a crazy question. Of course they do.
Do people need incentives to come to work every day? Yes.
So the focus was definitely on production. And we also had a few special incentives then. I mean, people may or may not remember 421G.
I was about to ask you about that.
Yes, absolutely. During that time, what you had was like millions of like moribund square feet of office space in lower Manhattan. And look now, because of 421G, which has gone away, that's been transformed into 30,000 residential apartments. Those apartments are on the tax base now, contributing to New York City's economic expansion. And you have a full-time residential community there that was sort of literally born out of all those sort of that time period from the late 90s to the early 2000s, where the age of the internet, it just taken hold, and you had electronic trading, and you had all this sort of space in Lower Manhattan. We don't physically need these trading floors anymore. All these people don't need to sort of transact business this way. And the city was very much able to see that we need a different use for all this space. So the legislature rightly came up with this targeted incentive that literally did its job. When people ask me, do these incentives work? I always point to 421. I say, you literally created 30 residential apartments out of what used to be office space. And again, it received the benefits for the time period that it was supposed to, but now it's on the tax rolls fully paying tax. I know that it works because I saw it with my own eyes.
So the argument that people make, or the legislature makes, or others that are against 421A or incentives in general, is that it's a giveaway, which is not entirely true, because you're not going to get that building in the first place and that tax revenue at a later date if the housing isn't built at all. And you're certainly not going to get people to live there and improve that neighborhood and create more jobs.
Yes, I mean, it's funny to think now, but I remember when it was sort of seen as undesirable to live in Lower Manhattan. But again,
so it wasn't a neighborhood like it is now.
Right. And that is exactly right. And it's precisely because we had incentives that primed that pump. I mean, I could go back earlier than that. Some of the sort of, even the earlier ones, like J51, barely survived the legislature. But there was a period of time in the 70s and 80s when New York had, speaking of ice, we started out this conversation talking about factory culture. New York used to have factories, and all that abandoned factory space was being tenanted as illegal occupancies. People were literally starting to live in lofts they called them lofts, but they were living in old factories that were unsafe, but they were being used as residential purposes nonetheless. And J51 was used to turn all those old factories into legal residential lofts. The legislature has so many examples of how incentives work, which is why it's really hard for me not to start laughing when I hear a legislator talk about how incentives don't work.
Well, is it because you think they either A, they haven't experienced it like you have and some of us have, or B, that they're just ignoring it completely because it doesn't support their argument? Namely, I think probably trying to get good cause eviction or any other types of legislation passed that they couldn't get passed otherwise.
Well, I know the data's there. I'm a data king.
Numbers don't lie, right?
Yeah, numbers don't lie. So I know what housing incentives have done for New York City. That data is undeniable. I just don't think it supports their talking point. And when the data don't support your talking points, you try to change the conversation. But I've offered to talk to any legislature. I'll be in Albany again next week as part of the budget hearings. Sort of say, listen, we can actually show you how 421A has worked since 1971 when you first passed it. We know what it does. We know what J51 does. I know what 421G has done. These stories are recorded. And largely what I find is that it's not a conversation about the data. It's a conversation about we want to focus you elsewhere.
Yeah.
Because on the data, you cannot win.
I read some testimony that you had for the Joint Legislative Budget Committee. Is it Budget Committee? Is that what they're called?
That's correct. The Assembly and the Senate together have their joint budget hearings.
And you talked about a lot of this stuff, including 421G, saying that it helped to revive, rebuild, and transform Lower Manhattan following the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and about 421A and G, which together incentivize private sector to work collaboratively with the government to provide and modernize housing while stimulating the construction and general contract job sectors, which goes back to what we were talking about, which is you're creating jobs, you're creating lives for people through housing. Under what guise were you testifying before that committee? Like, what was the purpose of that testimony? What was the circumstances of that testimony?
Well, I think it was housing partnership does not exist without tax incentives. That's just a plain fact. So
neither do we, by the way.
So I hopefully my role there was to sort of remind our decision makers about how incentives fit into the overall economic development piece and how economic development obviously fits into job creation and revenue creation. I think New York's proposing like a $223 billion operating budget this fiscal year. And always, where do you think that money comes from? It does not grow on trees. It grows on economic activity. It really scares me how many people I meet that think money grows on trees.
Despite the fact that your parents constantly tell you that's not the case, right?
But they really believe it. But unless we continue to expand our economic base, we will not have $223 billion to spend. And I know there's some people that think, well, we could just tax billionaires and that'll come, but that's not work. The only thing that is going to make us have those resources, and we want those resources. We want to fund our colleges. We want to fund our schools. We want to fund our parks. We want to fund our uniformed and services. We want that money. We want to pay for roads, but it all comes from economic activity, and we have to expand it every year. And so, I'll never stop saying that. This is the way we provide for that. And if we don't expand our economic base, then, the same thing that happens every year. We get 6 months into the fiscal year and they say, we're not raising as much money as we needed to. Now we need to make cuts, and we know how painful cuts are. And we have to start talking about what HPD can't do out of its planned capital budget. And we can always sort of have our cake and eat it too, so to speak, if we always are focusing on how to grow our economic.
When you delivered that testimony, which I read and I thought was very powerful, very convincing, and I agree with all of it, do you get reactions from them? Do you get to talk to any of the legislators afterwards, beforehand, to get responses, to get honest reactions to what you're saying to them? Has that happened?
It hasn't happened to date. I've had the opportunity to remind a legislator to projects that are in their district that were, serving their constituents that are a result of housing incentives. So I always like to do that. But I think the Albany process is very formal. It's more of the things where you show up and you just make sure that you're there and you say your statement and that you are represented. And, the larger thing is, the legislature and the governor are going to have the negotiation. There should not be a year that passes where the formal record does not say we must have housing incentives to expand our economic. So that's my role. I always make sure that somebody's up there saying that.
I'm so happy that you're doing it, particularly because you have something to back it up. It's not someone saying it how it works.
Yes.
You have 2 decades plus to back it up. And yesterday, we actually spoke to a partner at our firm, Jason Hershkowitz, who heads up our tax incentives group. But it's a bare bones, which is governors saying, okay, last year I didn't have a proposal. Here's a new one, which is pretty much the same as the old 421A. But I'm not going to tell you what the AMIs are. I'll let HPD figure it out. When Jason and I spoke, and we actually did a short podcast on this that will air, is I think it's a great tactic because that's really what they are harping on, whether it's correct or not. And if you take that out of the equation, what else can they say? Let the city decide because they're in the best position. Do you have any thoughts on that proposal?
Well, many people or some people may remember that one of the earlier versions of the 421A program was the certificate program, where the legislature basically said you can have this program, but then the city council actually came up with sort of local particulars of it. And I thought that program worked really well, but then at some point someone thought it didn't work so well and they scrapped. That was very much a program that was established by the legislature. And then the council came along and said, well, we're going to carve out this area of the city where you can't get this, except if you provide an affordable housing. And that's how that whole exclusion zone and certificates were. That was my era of 421.
Yeah.
So there's precedent for that. That's what I want to be clear about is, if the legislature and the governor are sort of saying we can have this program, but we want the locality to come up with the particulars. I think that there's precedent. We've done that before. I just think we need any incentive at this point. We just need to get it done.
Developers should be incentivized in many ways, particularly because of the archaic way that property is assessed and the way the taxes are inflicted. They don't overhaul it, but I think the best they can do is try to just work their way around it. There's
also the fact that they've created other programs based on the assumption of this tax exemption or tax incentive. And now that the incentive is gone, there are other programs out there that are basically not financially feasible without the incentive.
Yeah.
Right. It certainly takes the teeth out of mandatory inclusionary housing.
Yeah.
But I think that just to your point that you just made, New York needs to remember its competitive advantage. I was at a housing conference last summer and someone made a very good point about that dollar can be invested in New York. It can be invested in Tennessee and it can be invested in Texas. And New York needs to make sure that it's still attractive to invest that dollar in this jurisdiction. Because if I'm just seeking a 10% return and I can get a 10% return with no hassle in Nashville, I'm probably going to go there. And that's what I think our legislators are forgetting. You're losing. Ever since we tapped out to Virginia with that Amazon deal, we have forgotten, but by the way, that still boggles my mind.
Yeah.
We gave up 100,000 jobs. That's just crazy.
And people are just looking at these incentives that pale in comparison to what you're getting in return, especially over the long run. Maybe you're giving a huge payment or huge subsidies, whatever it is at the time, but you're talking about over time, this is building up an area, decreasing crime, bringing economics to the city.
Yes.
I just don't get it. We don't get it either.
Look at what you're getting in exchange rather than what you're losing out on or what you claim to be losing out on. But if nothing happened to begin with, you lose out on everything, not just the portions that you seem to be focused on.
You had all the publicity around, Amazon is going in another direction. But I was recently in Arlington, Virginia. They're actually building that headquarters.
And I'm sure the community around it is thriving because of it.
Yes. And I mean, it's just it's the most physical representation of a loss. They're building that. We could have had that. We could have added that to our economic, and is now in Virginia. So we lost out. New York can't continue to take losses. We won't be able to.
And in the same vein as the things that we're talking about now, you had in October of 2022, you wrote an op-ed in Crain's that basically said, do you want to build affordable housing? Here's the 4 things you need to do. The first is you want to renew those critical housing programs like 421 G51. Then you want to create even more incentives, which I completely agree with. Those are not even sufficient to incentivize the amount of housing that we need. Then you said we have to trim the time-consuming zoning process and also streamline city reviews, all of which I agree with. And I think you've grasped the entire world of this. And one thing that I've experienced, which I thought it was interesting when you wrote this article, which you wrote that when you were running the tax incentives program at HPD, there were 2 agencies responsible for reviewing and approving housing incentives, the Department of Finance and Department of Housing Preservation and Development. Now there's a 3rd agency.
Yes, OMB. Yes.
And we're familiar with OMB. It's strange. I don't know who works there. I've never met them. And in fact, I think they may be a figment of HPD's imagination. And they always blame them. Oh, we never heard back from OMB. And I'm like, who actually works there? What have been your experiences with OMB?
I definitely think I have met the budget director several times during the Bloomberg administration. But I think, again, we're in a housing crisis. You can't go anywhere out of your building, my building, and not palpably see what the housing crisis is. Is this why do we need 3 city agencies approving these benefits? I just look at it more from a process efficiency. The three agencies get together and sort of say, okay, we're going to blanket approval these, but maybe we'll like reserve these big kahunas. They'll still have to go through OMB. When you get to the stage of having a housing crisis, it's like emergency, 911, red lights, and everybody needs to focus on process efficiency. So I was actually astonished when someone told me all incentives, housing incentive applications have to go through OMB. That literally did not exist during the Giuliani administration.
And then, that things are taking much longer as a result because some of the stuff is really complicated and, different offices don't necessarily agree with one another. So there's pushback.
Or they don't communicate with one another, which communication has always been a tremendous problem among city bureaucracies. Then all the city agencies start to have severe staffing issues. And
turn around.
Yeah. And then so you used to think like someone needs to come through. The mayor has this authority and to sort of say, we're going to reform. If it didn't used to be this way, why is it like this today? And sort of how can we sort of get what we need to do? I mean, we want to make sure there's no abuses, but do we really need this sort of process? Let's just go back and start over.
Yeah. No, it's a good perspective from someone who was there leading, heading up tax incentives. The things that you say should speak volumes to others. I think that authority is very important. So now I want to just turn to like your transition from NHP to Housing Partnership. And it's actually pretty recent, right? It's just been approximately a year.
A year and change, yes. Thank you.
So how did you get introduced? What kind of work are you doing now? What do you see for the future?
Sure. Well, I just want to take a few moments just to explain what a great organization the Housing Partnership is and the sort of transformations it's had to go through over the years. So the Housing Partnership was actually founded by David Rockefeller and Edward Koch. And it was set up to deal with a tremendous problem that New York City once had, which was tax-foreclosed housing, tax-foreclosed lots. We obviously think, really?
Right.
Yeah, New York at some point had as many as 35,000 tax foreclosed properties. So they had it taken and didn't know what to do with. And so it used the Housing Partnership to return all of those tax foreclosed properties to productive use as affordable housing. That line of business, if you will, dried up around 2001, 2002, where the city found that, look, we actually did our economic development duty. We returned all these plots of housing and plots of land, if you will, to productive use. And then the Housing Partnership didn't need to do that. It didn't need to be a receiver of properties from the city, and sort of transformed itself at that point into more of an intermediary that worked with developers to help them obtain tax and zoning benefits, which I think that's how they found me, quite frankly. They say, oh, you've done this for a number of years. So I didn't have to come to the Housing Partnership sort of getting educated about what tax and zoning incentives were.
You were doing the educating.
Right. So going forward, we will always continue to be closely aligned with the city and the state's housing policies, because that's our agenda. Our agenda is what the city and the state want to do for affordable housing. So we will continue to do that. I am very much interested in the partnership, becoming involved in faith-based development for obvious reasons, right? So the partnership has not been involved in that. And the partnership, we did launch a couple of years before I came, energy business, to help owners and developers sort of take advantage of green incentive. We already have that relationship with them. And some of our older buildings need retrofit. Well, I think we could all be proud of saying that any new building that's built now is going to have the green technology.
It has to.
It has to.
Yeah.
I remember a time when there was a debate, or, only the luxury developers would do the green technology. But now all new construction. So look what a tremendous public policy achievement we got right there. But a lot of our older properties, and let's face it, New York has a lot of old buildings, need those green retrofits. So we want to be in that space as well. So we're doing a little bit of strategic planning right now to figure out what makes sense for us to be. We want to be in the green space and doing green retrofit to help sort of the older buildings catch up. But I'm very much thinking it's going to be more incentives, right? I'll never get away from that. That's part of my traveling sermon.
What else would it be?
Right. So those three lines of business: green, continue to be an intermediary for city and the state's housing production, and also getting the partnership into working with faith-based development. I have 12 years experience doing that now, so I want to continue.
And something that I alluded to previously, and maybe I was incorrect, I thought that Housing Partnership also owned its own properties and or developed projects themselves.
Very small. That's a very small part of our business. We do have, a lot of people don't know, but we do have the Greater Newark Housing Partnership, as in Newark, New Jersey, where we've actually done some development there. And we do have what I we call a strategic development, where we will actually be part of the fee developer structure. But it's not the majority of our business. But we do have a new board chairman coming. It's actually officially on board now. And I know that he probably is going to be very strong with getting the partnership more involved with development. You may know him, Ron Moelis. So as of the new year, Ron Moelis is now the chairman.
That's amazing. So you have somebody who really knows this industry.
So I'm very excited about that. I think Ron is going to be the perfect fit for a lot of our strategic work that we're doing. And he knows the history of the partnership, and he's very excited about sort of launching us into our next 40 years.
And I know that the Housing Partnership does a lot, and we've worked with you guys a lot to do, marketing and leasing up. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on the recent settlement in connection with the community preference, where the settlement concerned the lawsuit. And then I think it was filed maybe 9 years ago, around the time I started.
It's been going on for a while.
And then they eliminated that preference, which changes, the marketing significantly. I don't know if you had any thoughts on that issue and how that's going to change the marketing and lease up of affordable units going forward?
Well, again, just a bit of history. When I first started at HPD in the late 1990s, the community preference was 20% of the unit. So over the years, I think they increased it as a way to make it easier for projects to get passed through ULURP. Well, look, a lot of the units are actually going to the neighborhood, so it's a neighborhood project. But I think the legal context of this takes us back to Texas. And who knows, I don't know why the city decided to settle the suit, but I do know that there were a couple fair housing suits in Texas that went up to the Supreme Court already. And the Supreme Court said, no, actually, the Fair Housing Act does actually apply here, and you cannot do this as far as local preference. And so my guess is someone looked at that and said, look, this has already been to Supreme Court, so we're not headed that route because there's legal precedent here. But it's a tough issue. It's a really tough public policy. I started out this conversation talking about why I think all affordable housing should be exempt from sort of local zoning, and because it's such a public mandate and a public good. So obviously I come down on the side of mass production of affordable housing, and anything that gets in the way of that, people saying, I don't want this here unless all the units can be rented by people who live in the neighborhood. I'm not going to be.
It's right. We need housing production, and we need it quick. And so we should be building housing and putting more stock on market for our economy and for the people of New York City.
Yeah. And, it already takes a substantial amount of time to lease up again, I'm talking about process efficiency. In a housing crisis, we should be finding a way to put people in these lottery units in 2 months, not 6 months, in 2 weeks, not 6 months.
Yeah. But why is it? I mean, we understand it because we see it. And we pull out our hairs every single day of the week. Why is it that it takes such a long time, not only to complete the construction, but specifically to then rent up an affordable unit and actually get people housed? So you build a building, you have units available, and then it takes months and months for it to get built.
I think it takes about 6 months.
Sometimes longer, right?
I think over the years, we have become so, we want to deliver fairness in the marketing process. But in sort of trying to do that, it's made it much longer to actually rent the. So it's one of those things, just like we talked about, why are there 3 city agencies involved in sort of approving tax exemption? I think we need to take a step back and say, obviously we're concerned. We want to make sure that these units are fairly marketed, but 6 months is too long. So how can we just go and look at the process again and sort of drive that goal back to make it 2 weeks? So it just needs some process efficiency work.
The other issue with that timing is that by the time you get back to the applicant, they could have found another place.
Hopefully they did, right?
Yeah. Or they could, they could just say, I'm not interested, or they don't have the money, they lost their job, or they're making too much money, whichever one it is. And now you've lost that tenant, and now you have to start that process all over again to try to find a new tenant for that particular unit.
And then on the developer side, because I never forget the perspective of the developer, they're needing tax credits to be delivered, and they can't wait 6 months. And, their tax credit investors don't want to hear, it's going to take 6 months. Excuse me? It's going to take how long? Until they hit that point of lease up, they're not getting their equity paid. So it helps. I always say it helps if you worked on both sides. You worked on the developer side and the government side. So you understand where the pressure points are.
Yeah, you've got that dual perspective.
Yes.
You've been so lovely with your time, and I'm so appreciative. I don't know if you have anything else that you want to discuss or talk about, anything else that you feel that's...
I will always continue to press the point that the legislature has decided that schools are enough of a public benefit that they don't need to go through typical zoning processes, which we know are sometimes used by opponents to actually kill the project. And affordable housing, affordable, decent, safe housing is as much of a public benefit as a new school. So we need to continue to and sort of press upon all of our legislators that they need to start treating affordable housing the same way that they treat new school production. And it should be in the governor's budget proposal. Maybe not this year, but maybe next year. We need to have more people starting to talk about these things. It just makes no sense that it would take 4 years, 3 years to produce new housing. Come on, people in the world must be laughing at us when they see that. I'm not here to sort of dispel the need for sort of local review, but when I see that dynamic that now people are using our ULURP processes to kill projects, something we need some reform. That is a signal to me that we need some fundamental zoning reforms, and they need to be led by the state.
Well, thank you for coming this way to talk about it.
Yeah,
we appreciate it.
We agree with everything you've said. We're happy to help fight that good fight that you're fighting. I'm excited to see the things that Housing Partnership, how it's going to evolve under your leadership, and it's going to be so exciting to see how things change, because even in the 8 or 9 years that I've been dealing with them, they've changed, they've evolved, and it's been a different business, and you guys change with the times. And I think that's how you survive. And that's how New York City is going to survive, by changing with the needs, like adopting things like a 420G that saved us after 9/11.
Well, thank you.
Totally.
Yeah, you're a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Well, everyone, that's our show. Thanks so much for listening.
And of course, don't forget to subscribe. Also, don't forget to leave comments, because we love to hear from our audience, right, Brenda?
Yeah, feel free to reach out at info@sideandshine.com or visit our website at sideandshine.com. We really look forward to hearing from you.
You could also reach out to David and Brenda at dshamshovich@sideandshine.com and Beaslakowski at sideandshine.com.
Those are lengthy last names. You can just find us on our website.
That's right.